Welcome to the Bright Ideas podcast, where we unpack innovative ways to improve online course design. I'm Madison.
I'm Kelsey.
And we're instructional designers for the Lone Star College System.
So welcome to the second episode of our podcast. We're kicking off our first series, which is on engagement. Madison and I, bounced around ideas of what to do for the podcast, and basically all of the little tips and tricks that we came up with basically boiled down to student choice and some sort of interactivity. So we decided to build this episode around inquiry-based learning.
Yeah, so what is inquiry-based learning? So inquiry-based learning simply is just an instructional model and a way to structure your lessons. And what's unique about it is that it is all revolving around your students answering a guiding question.
So how is a question you use for inquiry-based learning different from a typical knowledge check that you would see during lecture?
So the biggest difference is that this question really lends itself to exploration and application of material. So if we're talking about your traditional classroom, where you are asking for knowledge check type questions, usually those answers can come directly from some kind of source, so like a textbook or a lecture.
Right.
Whereas in inquiry-based learning, that question that you're really asking them has them
synthesizing.
Yeah.
I like to think of it as instead of when you're asking a knowledge check question, they're basically picking up one piece of content, say, here's the thread, this is it. With inquiry-based learning, they're having to pull all of this information, all of those threads of knowledge, and weave it together to come up with some sort of understanding, whether that's new knowledge, whether that's a solution, whether that's a prototype that they build, but it's all built around this question, and that's what you're doing either at the lecture, at the course, or at an assignment level. So inquiry is, as you can probably tell, a very broad concept. If you've heard of project-based or problem-based learning, both of those fall under inquiry-based learning. So we're thinking, just to get kind of oriented with this idea, we wanted to start with levels of inquiry. So we're going to talk about, for most of this podcast, structured, guided, and open. And really, all of those is a continuum of how much support you as an instructor are providing to students as they're answering these questions. And in terms of what they have in common, all of them have, we've been saying, this driving question. Now, this may be something that you provide directly to students, one question. It may be one that they're creating. It could be a collaboration between you and the students to pick a question. There's typically always some sort of process or method. This may be very structured depending on your discipline, like the scientific method. It could also just be, this is how I'm going to answer this question. These are the discipline practices that I'm going to use. These are the conventions. And then there's some sort of engagement with the content, some sort of exploration component. Mm-hmm. So with that, let's start with what is structured inquiry.
Yeah, so structured inquiry is the level of inquiry where the instructor has kind of the most control over the process, right? So in this level, the instructor is really going to provide everything that the student needs in order to answer that question. So we're going to actually start with providing them with the question. Then we're going to provide them with the process that we want them to use, as well as any materials or resources that they're going to explore to answer that question. So in this level of inquiry, every student is going to have the same experience from the get-go.
Right. I like to think of it as most people have experienced your typical lab assignment where you get procedure, you get materials list, everyone has the same equipment, you kind of know we're going to be mixing chemical A and chemical B, and we're expecting to get a certain type of reaction. So it's very structured, and typically with kind of structured inquiry, this might be something that they're doing at the same time, so they're going through the steps together. Now, I think a lot of times there is this idea that maybe this highly structured setting is maybe not as good as if you gave them full reign, which we'll talk about later. But I think the key here is thinking about who your learners are, like where they are in the learning process, where they are in the course. Is it the beginning of the semester? Is it the end of the semester? And what skills do they have to answer these questions? So, structured learning might be really helpful in certain scenarios, and open inquiry might be helpful in others.
Yeah, so one isn't really better than the other. Yeah. And so if we want to kind of think of this in like
an analogy.
An analogy, not like so heavy into like education or content. We have thought of this analogy that we think is pretty applicable here. So imagine that you are going on a hike, okay? And if you are on a structured level hike, you are going to have a park ranger with you the entire hike. You're going to be given an itinerary that's telling you where you're stopping along the way and where you're going to end. And then you also are given a pack with everything that you will need for that hike, including what you need to wear, what you need to take with you. So a structured level really is just having that guide along the way.
Right. And, how does this connect with engagement? Even though it's a shared experience, like everyone's kind of getting very similar experience, even though it's very structured, it's hands-on. And I think that's really what distinguishes inquiry-based learning from other methodologies.
Yeah, so that kind of leads us into guided level of inquiry. So for our guided level, this really is just the instructor reining back some of those resources and supports. So really what differentiates this from structured is that maybe I'm going to give them a materials list, but I'm not going to give them the process, right? Maybe the question is something that I give them, or maybe they create their own or choose from a list of questions. So you really have the ability to kind of meet your students where you feel like they are ability-wise.
Yeah, so like on that continuum from structured to open, we're kind of in the middle. It's very flexible, and I think, what you choose to pull scaffolding from will depend on your subject and depending on what you want students, like what skills you want them to be developing. If we're taking like these lab example, it would be similar to you're still providing a materials list and the materials that they're going to use. You may have some procedures, but it may not be as detailed. They may need to know how to turn on the Bunsen burner. They may need to know how to clean up the lab space. And you may not be telling them what to expect when they, for example, like combine chemical A and chemical B. And that's part of the experience, is saying, okay, you're following these kind of general instructions. What are you discovering? And that discussion becomes like a very key component of the learning experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so like if we're thinking hike, right? So this guided hike might be that I'm given a map and I'm given some procedures of what I need to see, or some spots of what I need to see along the way, but I can choose the trail, I can choose the other stops. Maybe I just need in my parameters to see a waterfall, right? Well, I can pick my own path,
right?
But I'm still have that guidance along the way, right? Maybe there's a park ranger that can help me get back on the trail if I get off of it a little bit. So in the guided level of inquiry, you still have that structure and that support.
Right. So then we move on to open inquiry. And I think this is often the scarier one for instructors, because it is a little bit more open-handed. But let's unpack what we really mean by when we say open.
Yeah, so when we're thinking of the open level, we are thinking of a level that gives students a lot of autonomy. In the previous two levels, we really have had the instructor kind of front load a lot of the resources and the things that we deliver to the students. In this level, maybe as the instructor, I give them kind of like a theme or a topic, but what kind of differentiates this level is that the students really, you want to get them to generate their own questions.
Right, and this typically, they've built up the skills to do this when you're using open-based inquiry. With the lab example, it's not just unleashing students onto the lab and saying, go mix things and see what happens.
Yeah.
It looks something more like, say your topic is on photosynthesis, and students have to come up with a a hypothesis in relation to that. They've got to design an experiment on what they want to test to answer that question. And then they've got to do it. And I will say with open inquiry, something that's really helpful is to have some sort of check-in point with some instructor oversight before they get too deep into the experience, so that you can provide that correction. Like, oh, if you add those two things, they will catch on fire. So don't do that. So there's still, again, the students are asking the questions, and what they're actually doing in the lab setting, for example, may look different. But they're using the same pieces of knowledge, and they're getting to pick how they're using it.
Well, and I think that's an important thing to really note in this instructional model, is that as the instructor, since a lot of this is the students taking kind of the rein in the learning process and like the journey along the way, right? The instructor is still really important to be that check-in and that person that has the expertise, right? And so even though it may feel like an instructor doesn't have like firm control at that individual moment, you really do still, because you are the one that's guiding the process.
Yeah, from the instructor side, it's definitely more of a mentorship experience, and you get to focus more of your energy on feedback, which I think is what most educators really value.
Yeah. Well, and students too.
Sure.
And so if we're still talking about our open level, right, what this would look like in our hike analogy would be that basically, as the student or as the hiker, right, the world is your oyster, essentially. But you're still going to be given like parameters, right? So if I know I need to take a hike, I know I need to see a waterfall at some point, and I know that hike needs to be in like a national park, okay? There's my parameters, but then I really have a choice in making those decisions of where I'm going to hike, what I'm going to see along the way. And again, that park ranger, that instructor, right, is still there to help me along the way and to check in with me along the way.
I think like an example of open inquiry most of us have encountered and been in is your typical research paper, where they've assigned a theme, but students have to come up with a research question. They've got to decide what sources they're going to use. They've got to vet those sources. They've got to come and draw conclusions. So I think it's that model, but applied in so many different areas rather than like a written assignment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that kind of leads us into, well, where do we start?
And now we got you all excited about inquiry-based learning. How do you do that?
Yeah, so I think when in doubt, start small, right? So this is not something that I would take and then like try to change,
overhaul the course,
everything.
Yeah.
Start small, find an assignment that you think that you could open up a little bit to more discovery and exploration of your students. There's other ways that you can do that too. Maybe you can look at a unit that you have where maybe the content is kind of dry and students aren't really students aren't really engaging with it a lot. Maybe you can look in that unit of study and see where maybe again you can apply some of these principles.
I think also like if you see one topic that really it's really important that students like combine the information. So like not just like know this, but they have to know how those two interact. That really lends itself towards inquiry-based learning as well.
Yeah, because it's really revolving around this question, right? And so what makes a good question for this type of learning? I think first and foremost, you want to look at questions that allow you to make connections, right? And to synthesize information. Because if you don't have enough of that within, or enough room for that within your answer of your question, it's not going to give a really like rich experience to your students.
And that's why I think a lot of times people are like, oh, create an open question versus a closed question. And most of the time we say that's like, oh, that's not like, open means it's not a yes or no question. But I think with inquiry-based learning, you have to dig a little bit deeper because you need them to be pulling information and synthesizing it. So it's not just, what is an ecosystem? It's more like, here's an ecosystem. What if you had, your primary producer removed from that? What would happen? And what changes could be made within, these resources to restore the ecosystem? That's a very much like richer type of question, and yeah, it's not a yes or no, but it's really different from like, tell me the definition of an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Same thing with like if you want to think about questions that are multifaceted or can be looked at with different perspectives or lenses. So I think about this like more in like English, but maybe you have this question that you pose and students could look at it through the lens of like social issues or economic issues, or you have all these different ways that you could approach finding information about the question. Those are really good questions too. And I think lastly, when we're thinking about what type of question we should be choosing for our course is question scale.
Right. So this kind of relates to both like the breadth of the question and your time constraint. Like if you're doing like a 15-minute breakout, just being mindful of like if you want them to go find their resources and read the resources and process that, probably not like a super great fit.
Yeah.
Versus, and also like if this is like, if you're using this for like their capstone project, you want it to be broad enough to where they can really, you know, dig deep into their interests. So scale in terms of time, but I think also, again, where your students are, you know, how you scale it at the beginning of the semester may look really different than once they've had some practice and they are familiar with the discipline a little bit more and what you're doing towards the end of the semester.
Yeah, so start small and then you're probably going to start more structured too.
Yes, I think structured is a great place to start.
So that kind of concludes our episode for today.
To inquiry.
Remember that if you are part of the Lone Star College system and you would like to start implementing some of these inquiry-based design principles into your own course, you have the ability to sign up for a consultation with our instructional designers through VTAC. That is our shameless plug for our episode.
We want to talk to you.
Yeah, and we can help you looking at, you know, your course as a whole, as well as maybe where to start small.
Yeah, like a discussion question.
And if you don't work at Lone Star, then make sure to drop any questions in our comment section below.
Yeah, and please like and subscribe.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.